that less than a decade before he was earning $500,000 per episode, Kit Harington was an unknown stage actor struggling to pay rent? No fame, no fortune, no certainty that acting would even work out. He was just another drama school graduate chasing auditions, performing for tiny crowds, and waiting for a break that might never come. Yet somehow, that same young man landed a role on a risky new HBO series, a role that would not only define his career, but transform him into one of the highest paid actors in television history. This isn't just a story about Jon Snow. It's about how Kit Harington went from stage obscurity to $500,000 per episode, and the unbelievable journey in between. Our story takes us to the mid-2000s and focuses on a young man named Christopher Catesby Harington. Kit, to his friends, is lugging bags across the city, darting between auditions and often hearing one word that every actor dreads: no. Before he became the brooding Jon Snow, Kit Harington was just another face in an overcrowded world of theater hopefuls. He had studied at the Central School of Speech and Drama, a place that chums out talent year after year. But for every actor who makes it, there are hundreds more who vanish into the grind, waiting tables, pouring pints, and hoping someone will notice them under the dim lights of a tiny stage. That was Kit's life, and all he did was perform in small, almost anonymous theater productions. Some nights the audience was so sparse you could count them on one hand. The pay, barely enough to cover the rent, let alone a proper meal. Friends recall him living modestly, surviving on determination more than cash. In those days, Kit wasn't a star. He was a kid chasing a dream in a city that barely cared. And here's the central question that drives his story. How does this struggling stage actor with no big credits, no industry clout, and no guarantee of breakthrough transform into one of the highest paid actors in television history, pocketing $500,000 for every single episode of Game of Thrones? The answer begins not in Hollywood, but in the theater. And not just any theater, but a play that would bring him into the spotlight for the very first time. But before that, remember that this guy was no one new. When Kit walked down the street, nobody stopped him, nobody asked for autographs. He was just another anonymous Londoner who blended into the crowd. If someone told you then that this young man would one day become the face of the biggest TV show on earth, you'd probably laugh. And yet, behind the uncertainty, something was brewing. A break was coming. The kind of break every actor dreams of, but few ever get. The stage was set. Kit Harington's life was about to change. The turning point came in the form of a horse, or rather, a war horse. It was 2008, and the National Theatre in London was staging a play unlike anything audiences had seen. Life-size puppets, intense storytelling, and a sweeping tale of friendship and survival during World War I. For Kit Harington, landing a role in War Horse was like stepping into the light for the first time. He played Albert, the young boy whose bond with his horse drives the heart of the story. And suddenly, people noticed. Critics praised the show. Audiences raved. For Kit, this wasn't just another anonymous gig. It was the recognition he had always worked hard for. The kind of recognition that whispers through casting rooms. Hey, have you seen this kid in War Horse? He's good. Night after night, Kit poured himself into the performance. Theater is a brutal teacher. There are no retakes, no second chances. If you stumble, the audience sees it. And Kit learned to command the stage with raw energy and vulnerability. This was where his reputation as a serious actor began to grow. Friends and colleagues later said that War Horse was the first moment Kit believed in himself as much as others did. For once, he wasn't just hustling for scraps. He was building a career. The play became a sensation, eventually transferring to the West End. Kit's role put him directly in front of casting agents and industry players who were searching for the next wave of talent. And here's the thing, without War Horse, there is no Jon Snow. It was this performance that convinced casting directors he could handle the weight of a complex lead role. The quiet intensity, the emotional depth, it all foreshadowed the qualities he would bring to the role that defined his career. At this point, Kit was still far from rich. He wasn't living in luxury, wasn't on magazine covers, wasn't known worldwide. But War Horse cracked open a door. For the first time, there was a glimmer of possibility, a path that could lead beyond the cramped theaters of London and into something far greater. And just around the corner, that something greater was waiting. Its name, Game of Thrones. Sometimes, fate has a sense of humor, And for Kit Harington, this chance at Game of Thrones didn't begin with polished perfection. It began with a black eye. The story goes that the very day he auditioned for Jon Snow, Kit walked into the casting room sporting a swollen shiner from the bar fight the night before. Not exactly the clean, polished look you'd expect for a career-defining audition, but in a strange way, it worked. The bruised, rough around the edges face, staring back at the casting directors, looked like someone who had lived through hardship, someone who carried a quiet toughness. In other words, someone who could be Jon Snow. HBO was on the hunt for authenticity, and they weren't just looking for seasoned Hollywood stars with glossy resumes. The creators, David Benioff and D.B. Weiss, wanted fresh blood, actors who could inhabit Westeros without dragging along the baggage of fame. And Kit fit the mold perfectly, especially since he wasn't famous. He wasn't expensive to handle, and he was raw, hungry, and believable. Still, it was a gamble, as Game of Thrones was no small object. This wasn't a one-off series. This was HBO betting big on a sprawling fantasy epic with dragons, kingdoms, and the weight of George R.R. Martin's cult novels behind it. Putting such a pivotal role in the hands of an unknown could have backfired spectacularly. But when Kit delivered his audition, the room went quiet. Casting director Nina Gold later recalled that his vulnerability and intensity felt real, like Jon Snow himself had walked into the room. The black guy only added to the sense that this young man had already been through battles, both literal and personal. In the end, HBO rolled the dice, and they gave the role of Jon Snow not to an A-lister, not to a Hollywood veteran, but to a kid who had just made a name for himself on stage. Kit didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything shifted. His life as a struggling stage actor was ending. His journey into the brutal, bloody world of Westeros was about to begin, and with it, the first real paycheck of his career. When the cameras first rolled on Game of Thrones in 2010, Kit Harington wasn't thinking about becoming one of the highest paid actors in television history. He was just grateful to have a job. Back then, the salaries were modest, at least compared to the astronomical figures that came later. Reports suggest that Kit and the other young leads earned somewhere around $100,000 per episode in the early seasons. A solid sum, sure, but hardly the kind of money that turns you into a millionaire overnight. Especially when filming dragged on for months in freezing locations like Northern Ireland and Iceland. What made it even stranger was the contrast. Almost instantly, Kit, from being unknown to being recognized everywhere. Fans shouted, "You know nothing, Jon Snow!" in the streets. Paparazzi started showing up, and he was on posters in magazines, on talk shows. Overnight, he was famous. But here's the twist. He wasn't rich, but fame came before fortune. Kit himself had admitted that during the early years of Game of Thrones, he lived in a small flat and the lifestyle of a global star hadn't caught up with his bank account yet. Of course, it was normal to be oblivious of the fact that you are a global brand. Imagine being stopped on the street every day, having strangers want photos, but still worrying about rent. That was Kit's reality, and honestly, it must have been weird for him. Like, is this what fame is all about? What was going to happen to his personal life? The early seasons were also a grind. He was young, inexperienced with television, and the physical demands of the show were brutal. Long shoots in armor, endless sword fights, and the emotional weight of carrying one of the central characters. He was working harder than ever, but financially, the payoff hadn't arrived yet. At least for someone powering a lead role on one of the greatest TV shows ever. Still, there was something priceless in those early paychecks, as it was the foundation of his career. Every episode, every line, every long night on set was an investment. The fame may have felt overwhelming, and the money may not have matched the attention, but the groundwork was being laid. Soon, the world would realize that Game of Thrones wasn't just another fantasy series. It was becoming a cultural phenomenon, and as the show's popularity skyrocketed, so too would Kit's salary. The boy with the black eye was about to become one of the most valuable actors on television. At first, Jon Snow wasn't the obvious star of Game of Thrones. The spotlight seemed scattered across dozens of characters. Kings, queens, and schemers in every corner of Westeros. But something happened as the seasons rolled on and audiences couldn't get enough of Jon. From the moment he joined the Night's Watch, Jon Snow represented something rare in the show. A character who felt noble, almost pure, in a world full of betrayal and blood. And fans latched onto him like a child to his mother. He was the underdog, the outsider, the quiet presence who carried himself with honor. Honestly, he was one of the few characters that everyone was supporting. It was a weird choice as this likable character was in a series famous for killing off favorites. Yeah, we saw that with the death of Eddard Stark, but Jon Snow felt like the heart audiences desperately wanted to survive. And with every passing season, his importance grew. By season 2, he was already a fan favorite. By season 4, whole subplots bent around him. The Wall, the Wildlings, the looming threat of the White Walkers. Viewers debated his fate endlessly online. Was Jon Snow the chosen one? Was he the key to the entire story? For Kit Harington, this shift was life-changing. Suddenly, he wasn't just part of the cast. He was becoming the face of the show. Posters plastered Jon Snow front and center. Trailers teased his battles, and when shocking moments hit, like his stabbing at the end of season 5, the internet practically broke. Is Jon Snow dead? Became one of the most asked questions on Google. This obsession mattered for more than just storytelling. In Hollywood, popularity equals leverage. The bigger Jon Snow became, the more valuable Kit Harington became. Fans weren't just watching Game of Thrones, they were watching him. By the mid-series, HBO executives knew the truth. Jon Snow wasn't expendable. He wasn't a character they could casually kill like Ned Stark or Robb Stark. Kit had become essential, and with essential status comes bargaining power. The young actor who once scraped by in tiny theaters now stood as one of the most important figures on television. His face was everywhere. His character drove the narrative, and the world hung on every twist in his storyline. Jon Snow's rise was more than just great writing. It was his ticket to true negotiating power. By the time Game of Thrones became a cultural juggernaut, HBO found itself in a tricky position. They had created a monster hit, but that success came with a price. The cast now understood their worth, and one character's stocks that had risen was Kit Harington's. Behind the scenes, whispers turned into hard negotiation. In Hollywood, contracts don't last forever, and when a show explodes, actors often negotiate to match their growing value. For the Game of Thrones cast, this moment came several times during the run. Each renewal meant new deals, higher stakes, and bigger salaries. HBO knew the risk, especially since fans were obsessed with characters like Tyrion, Daenerys, and especially Jon Snow. Losing any of them would be catastrophic. So when Kit and his co-stars came back to the table, HBO had little choice but to meet their demands. Kit, who started with a relatively modest paycheck, saw his earnings climb steadily with each new contract. By the middle seasons, his salary had reportedly doubled, then tripled. With every jump, HBO was essentially admitting, we can't do this without you. Negotiations weren't just about money, they were about control. Stars like Kit gained perks, influence over schedules, and a say in how their characters were treated. After all, imagine trying to market Game of Thrones without Jon Snow. Audiences would revolt, and this was something HBO couldn't risk. Industry insiders later revealed that the core cast, including Kit, formed a kind of bargaining unit. They negotiated together, ensuring nobody got left behind. But even within that group, Kit's role as Jon Snow carried unique weight. His storyline was central, his popularity unmatched, and his survival often dangled as a cliffhanger. HBO needed him in a way few actors ever get to experience. And so the paychecks grew from what started as thousands per episode into hundreds of thousands. By the time the show reached its later seasons, Kit was pulling in sums that once seemed unthinkable for a kid who had lived on theater scraps. For Kit, every contract renewal was proof of how far he had come. The once unknown stage actor was now one of the most valuable names in television, and HBO was paying dearly to keep it that way. By the time Game of Thrones reached its final stretch, Kit Harington had gone from being an unknown stage actor to one of the highest paid performers on television. The numbers tell the story. For seasons 7 and 8, Kit was pulling in a staggering $500,000 per episode. On paper, that meant 6 episodes equaled $3 million for season 7 alone. By season 8, the same deal repeated, added up, and Kit earned millions just for those final 12 episodes. For a man who once played to half-empty theaters, this was the kind of heyday most actors only dream of. But let's put that figure in context. Kit's salary placed him in the same league as TV royalty. The cast of Friends famously negotiated $1 million per episode by their last season. But that was for a lighthearted sitcom film on a soundstage, not an epic fantasy shot across multiple countries with a budget rivaling Hollywood films. Then there's The Big Bang Theory, whose lead almost earned $1 million per episode in later years. Again, a sitcom. Easier schedules, shorter shoots, no freezing nights in Iceland swinging a sword. Kit's $500,000 per episode may have been less, but the workload was arguably twice as punishing. And unlike ensemble comedies, where no single character carried the entire story, Game of Thrones leaned heavily on Jon Snow. His survival, his destiny, his role in the climactic battle for humanity. Kit wasn't just part of the show, he was one of its beating hearts. That made every line, every fight scene, every emotional breakdown worth a premium. In fact, by the final seasons, HBO's marketing campaigns revolved around him. Jon Snow's face was everywhere. Trailers, posters, late-night interviews. The question wasn't just, what happens in Game of Thrones? It was, what happens to Jon Snow? For Kit Harington, the kid who once scraped by on small theater projects, the leap was staggering. $500,000 for a single episode, more than most people make in a decade. He had reached the very top of the television mountain, but the crown came with a price. No amount of money could protect him from what came next. On paper, Kit Harington was living the dream. Millions in the bank, a starring role in the biggest show on earth, fans chanting his character's name across continents. But behind the glittering surface, the reality was far more complicated, because money doesn't erase pressure. And fame, in Kit's case, became suffocating. As Jon Snow's importance grew, so did the weight on Kit's shoulders. He wasn't just playing a character anymore. He was carrying the expectations of millions. Every scene was dissected, every performance judged. When fans argued about plot twists, Kit was often at the center of the storm. He later admitted the pressure nearly broke him. The fame was overwhelming. Strangers followed him, paparazzi hounded him, and he couldn't walk down the street without somebody shouting, "You know nothing, Jon Snow!" What once felt exciting quickly became exhausting, and then came the mental health struggles. Kit has spoken openly about how the intensity of Game of Thrones pushed him to his limits. The final seasons in particular took a heavy toll. While audiences debated character arcs, Kit was quietly battling depression and anxiety. At one point, he checked into a wellness facility to deal with stress and alcohol dependency. This was the hidden cost of those $500,000 per episode. Yes, the paychecks were life-changing, but the crown of being Jon Snow came with sharp edges. Fame can isolate, success can crush, and no salary can buy peace of mind. Even during filming, the physical demands were brutal. Long shoots in freezing conditions, endless fight choreography, and the constant secrecy of protecting plotlines. Kit once described it as like being in the military, except his battlefield was a film set, and the war was against exhaustion, expectation, and the fear of letting people down. To outsiders, $500,000 per episode seemed like the ultimate prize, but for Kit, it was more complicated. He wasn't just earning money, he was paying for his fame, his energy, and his mental well-being. The world saw the triumph, but behind the crown, Jon Snow's crown carried scars that no one else could see. When the credits rolled on Game of Thrones in 2019, Kit Harington stood at a crossroads. For nearly a decade, Jon Snow had been his world. Now the question lingered, what do you do after becoming the face of the biggest TV series on Earth? The first reality to face was financial. The $500,000 per episode salary was over, and that kind of payday was tied to a once-in-a-generation cultural phenomenon. Few shows before or since have generated that kind of money, and fewer actors have ridden such a wave. Kit knew he might never see the numbers like that again. But here's the twist. He didn't need to. The windfall from Game of Thrones secured his future. By the final seasons, Kit had earned millions, enough to take the pressure off forever. No more wondering about rent, no more scraping together meals like in his theater days. The Jon Snow fortune gave him something every actor craves: freedom. That freedom shaped his next steps. Instead of chasing another $500,000 role, Kit leaned into projects that intrigued him. He went back to theater, appearing in True West on the West End, not for the paycheck, but for the love of acting on the stage again. He chose smaller indie films like The Death and Life of John F. Donovan and Gunpowder, projects that let him stretch as an actor, even if they didn't dominate the box office. And then came Marvel. In 2021, Kit entered the MCU in Eternals as Dane Whitman, a character teased for a bigger future. It wasn't Jon Snow level fame, but it was another chance to play inside a global franchise. And let's be honest, when Marvel comes a-callin', you answer. Still, the most important part of Kit's post-Thrones era hasn't been his career, but stability. He married Rose Leslie, Ygritte, the love interest of Jon Snow, and together they've built a family away from the spotlight. He's spoken openly about prioritizing mental health after years of pressure, even checking into a wellness facility to get support at a crucial time. That decision, too, was made possible by financial freedom. He didn't have to chase the next big payday. He could slow down, reset, and choose what truly mattered. Kit Harington may no longer be commanding $500,000 an episode, but he doesn't need to. The crown from Westeros paid him enough to rule his own life, and that's worth more than any paycheck. Looking back, Kit Harington's journey feels like a story pulled from a legend. He began as a nameless theater actor, scraping together performances in tiny productions. His first real break came from Warhorse, a role that gave him confidence but not riches. Then, with a black eye from a bar fight, he walked into an audition and landed the role that would change everything: Jon Snow. From there on, the transformation was rapid and relentless. One moment, he was a nobody on London streets. The next, he was on billboards across the globe. One moment, he was earning just enough to get by. The next, he was pocketing $3 million in a single season. But the beauty of Kit's story is how all the pieces lined up. Talent alone wasn't enough, but it was the timing that mattered. HBO launched Game of Thrones at the perfect moment, when fantasy was ready to break through mainstream culture. Luck mattered too. 1,000 tiny accidents, from that black eye to the decision by HBO to cast unknowns, made his rise possible. And then there was the juggernaut itself, the cultural tidal wave of Game of Thrones, a show so big it changed television forever. By the time the final seasons aired, Kit had gone from the kid in that horseplay to one of the highest paid actors on the planet. $500,000 per episode, a figure that put him alongside TV legends like the Friends cast and the stars of The Big Bang Theory. For a young actor once worried about making rent, it was surreal. Yet beyond the numbers, the real legacy is transformation. Kit didn't become rich, he became iconic. He embodied Jon Snow so completely that the character and the actor are forever entwined. Fans still debate his storylines, still quote his lines, still see him as the brooding hero who knew nothing but carried everything. And in that, there's a poetic final note. The boy who knew nothing grew into a man who knows his worth. Not just in terms of money, but in terms of craft, resilience, and legacy. Kit Harington proved that even an unknown can climb from the shadows of the stage to the very peak of television stardom. From unknown to icon, his journey is proof that sometimes the unlikeliest heroes end up shaping the biggest stories.